Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started here. We're grateful for those who are gathered here in person and Texans who are joining us from all across the state for this second half of our program. And we're going to introduce the panel in just a moment, but we want to thank our hosts at University of Houston Downtown and welcome President Lauren Blanchard to the microphone here to offer some brief words of welcome. President Blanchard.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I just wanted to offer my special welcome here to the University of Houston Downtown. I know that most of you probably know how to get here, but one of the things that we get accused of all the time is that wayfinding is just really terrible here, and we can't find how to get to the main building. So for the first time, it's actually still being erected, but at the very top of the building, it now says University of Houston Downtown in bright blue letters. And I hope that some of you use that as your measurement of how to get to our campus here today. So I always say that also University of Houston Downtown is like one of the best kept secrets. And I mean that very sincerely because of the fact that we've got 14,000 students that we serve. 3,500 faculty and staff members who are dedicated to the education of our students. The average age of our students is 27. We serve 70% of our students are first generation. 50% of our students come from economically deprived backgrounds. But yet, in spite of all of those odds, every day they are beating the odds, and in many ways. And so today, in terms of the work that you are focusing in on, and I have to say that our partnership with the Texas Tribune has been a long one, and so really thrilled that both our editor-in-chief, Sewell Chan, as well as the senior director of events, Matt Ewalt, are both here, but that it really extends beyond the individuals. It's the organization itself that we have been partners with, and thrilled to have you all here. I'll say lastly that, education matters so much in this day and time. And certainly higher education for the individuals that we serve it really becomes an imperative for them in terms of the trajectory of their respective lives. And so when we talk about education here at the University of Houston Downtown, yes, we're talking about acquisition of learning skills and knowledge bases and professional dispositions, but we also have a very strong focus on experiential learning and civic engagement and the well-being of others and the well-being of community. And so when these individuals actually leave our university, we believe that, yes, they are prepared for the workforce, they are prepared for graduate and professional school, but that even more importantly, they're prepared to become leaders in their fields and leaders in their communities. And a lot of the discussion topics that you are engaged in today, especially around voters and preparing young people to become voters, and more importantly, to ensure that they understand the power of their vote, that matters to this population of students that we serve here as well. So cannot thank you enough for being here today, and certainly cannot thank the Texas Tribune for continuing to be a great partner to us. Enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you so much, President Blanchard. We now turn to our next panel, titled The Changing Face of Local News and What It Means for Texas. I'm going to briefly introduce our panel and then turn the program over to my colleague. Laurie Ezzell Brown is editor and publisher of the Canadian Record, an independent community weekly covering Hemphill County in the northeastern Texas Panhandle since 1893, and a legacy business owned and published by the Ezzell family since the late 1940s. She has served as board member, officer, and president of both the Panhandle Press Association and the Texas Press Association. Bob Moore is the founder and CEO of El Paso Matters, a nonprofit news organization that has published since 2020. His 40-year journalism career includes newspaper leadership roles in Texas and Colorado, and reporting work for the Washington Post, ProPublica, Texas Monthly, and other media outlets. Sherry Sylvester is a distinguished senior fellow at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. She is a political communications and public policy expert who has directed multi-million-dollar statewide campaigns in New York, New Jersey, and Texas, and has been involved in dozens of Texas political campaigns. And our moderator, my colleague Darla Cameron, is the Texas Tribune's managing editor for visual journalism. She oversees the work of the photo, multimedia, and data visuals teams, and works closely with the product engineering and design teams to elevate the Tribune's visual journalism. Before joining the Tribune, she worked at the Washington Post and the Tampa Bay Times. And with that, I turn the program over to my colleague, Darla Cameron.
Thanks so much, Matt. First, thank you to all of you for being here, those joining us in person and online. We're so grateful that you're here to listen and help us think through these thorny issues around local news and democracy. My name is Darla Cameron. I'm an editor at the Tribune, and I am really also grateful to these panelists who have so much experience as local journalists, and I'm curious what they have to say about this moment that we're in right now. I'm going to start with you, Laurie. Last year, the Tribune wrote a really fascinating story about the last days of your role as a publisher of a print publication, The Canadian Record. I love a quote from this. And it was about the end of the Record's print edition offers a fresh reminder of how perilous the news business is for most local publishers and the communities they are part of. So I want to ask you, what has happened in Canadian since last March?
Well, I hope this is working. Yeah, it is. Well, the end is overstating it. At this moment, I'm monitoring wildfires in the Texas Panhandle and the evacuation of, I don't think they're evacuating Canadian yet, but they're evacuating everything around Canadian. So I figure the community's next. So I haven't quit reporting. I haven't quit publishing news. I'm doing it now digitally on our website and on our Facebook page, and it's being very well read. It's just not. It's not obviously the most satisfying way to deliver news for me, or I don't know. It's not as satisfying, the work isn't, but I'm glad to be still keeping people informed, and they're grateful for it too. They wish we'd go back to print publication, and we're trying very hard to find some way to do that. But they miss it, and I miss it too, to be honest.
I totally understand. What do you think is the difference, and what in the process of stopping the print publication, what did it make you think about the role of that entity in the community?
Well, really, it's a gathering place. It's a conversation that we had every week, and it was something people could talk to each other about. Our format for our newspaper was, our front page was always a picture, a photo, somebody had brought us that was a good photo, or more often a photo I'd taken, and they loved that. They couldn't wait to see the front page of the newspaper every week and then see what was inside it. Our editorial views are not exactly in line with most of our readers, at least not in Hemphill County, and they seem to tolerate it. Sometimes they read it, sometimes they didn't read it. Sometimes they commented on it in the grocery store, or at the football game, or they'd come through the door and talk to me about it. But I think the important thing about it was it was a conversation. It was a way we had of communicating and talking about things and thinking things over. And I think that's what they miss the most, actually, now that it's not there.
That totally makes sense. Thank you. Sherry, I want to kind of spin off of that question. One of the many roles that you've played in the political and media ecosystem in Texas is that of a critic sometimes of how the media is portraying certain issues. How do you think people working in journalism can better listen to their communities and be in conversation with them?
Well, it's great to be here. Laurie will keep the panhandle in our prayers. I didn't realize that was going on up there.
Thank you.
It's really great to be here. I have three little things I want to say. One, and Darla and I have been talking about this concept of local news. So I have a news story for the reporters. When in 2000, 1,000 years ago, for the students that are here, I was in Nashville covering election night, Bush v. Gore. And as we saw, and you're seated in alphabetical order. I worked for the San Antonio Express News, so I was seated next to the St. Petersburg Times. St. Louis was on the other side. And as the evening began to develop, the pool, the reporters that actually get to be around the candidates, that you go in a pool and then you tell all the other reporters what happened. Well, I was listed in the pool. So when Gore went to make what we thought was going to be his concession speech, I was in the press car with the other two reporters. And a woman from the Washington Post, Cece Connolly, comes up to me and says, "I think you should give me your seat in the pool, because let's face it, my story is going to be on the front page of your paper in the morning, not yours." Well, it wasn't. So I thought her view of the San Antonio Express News, which is a big urban paper, was that it was local news. Local news. I'm not sure why I'm here. This has been a great event, probably because of my good friend Sewell and Matt Watkins and other people that I know. But I should have read Matt's email more clearly. I don't really think our democracy is in peril. I'm not worried about that at all. I do not believe the vote is being suppressed. I've worked on surveys of people voting in Texas. Almost 90% of people say it's easy to vote. That's all color people, all ages of people. So I don't see that. You can show it to me. I like the idea of childcare at the polls. I think that's a good one. I get up every morning, and right after I pray for my family, I pray that we will elect a legislature that will pass school choice so that some students in this state who have not had a chance and are trapped in failing schools get another chance. So I'm seeing the world a little differently. And when you break that down to the media, and whether that's local or national news, I began thinking about the border. You know, the border is the biggest story in the country. The border is a local news story in Texas. It's a local news story, and a number of years ago I was working in the Capitol, and the story was not really being covered very much by the Texas press. What was being covered was the Republican response to the story, and Abbott was out of line, he'd moved all these people down there. No one was covering this story. And Lieutenant Governor Patrick said to some TV reporter up in Dallas that they'd found 2,000 bodies of migrants in Brooks County who had died trying to make the journey and either, died from exposure, lack of water, lack of food, snake bites, they had died. Well, the press responded to that. PolitiFact, that's who responded. And they went down, very heavy-duty reporting had to be done, Laurie. They went to the sheriff's office and they said, yeah, I've probably more than 2,000. So there was a little local news story that got missed. And I think it's because we're feeding into the narratives rather than looking at what's actually going on. And to answer your question, right at the turn of the year, James Bennett wrote, the former op-ed page editor at the New York Times, wrote in The Economist, big scandal. He said the New York Times has become a place where, maybe I'm quoting this right, the progressive elite talks to each other about an America that doesn't exist. And when I read the Texas Tribune every day, read the Texas Press every day, I constantly wonder, why didn't they call me? Why didn't they ask the almost 70% of parents in this country and in the state that support school choice? Why didn't they go to polls? Why didn't they go find somebody that couldn't vote and to ask them why they couldn't vote? Why don't we talk to each other? To me, that's the hope for local news.
Absolutely.
Bob, thanks, Sherry. Bob, I want to kind of follow up because you've been a journalist on the border for most of your career and have done a lot of reporting there. How do you kind of put the situation on the border, which as we know is constantly evolving, how do you provide some ground truth to, the national narrative about what is happening there, since it's become such a political issue? How do you put that into context for the readers in El Paso?
Yeah, thanks. It's a very important question. Sherry mentioned that the border is a local story for Texas. It is an intensely local story for me and the community that I serve. And it's not just the national narrative around the border that's problematic. With all due respect, it is the state leadership rhetoric around the border that is also extraordinarily problematic. As somebody who not only reports on the border but lives on the border, most of what you hear in the political sphere is distorted to meet one political lens or the other. And this is not just an academic exercise. I want to take you back to August of 2019. There was a lot of rhetoric in the country at the time about the border being invaded. There was an unhinged young man in Allen, Texas, who was hearing those messages and decided that the best way to respond to an invasion was to grab a semi-automatic rifle he had recently purchased, drive 10 hours across Texas, walk into a Walmart packed with 1,500 people at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, and murder 23 of my neighbors. Right before he walked in to the Walmart, he posted a screed online that said he was coming out to stop the Hispanic invasion of Texas. So this distortion, and there was no invasion of the border. I will posit right now, there is no invasion of the border in the sense that most of us think about what an invasion means. There's not an armed incursion. What Russia did in Ukraine was an invasion. What is happening at our southern border now is not that. But that loaded rhetoric has incredible consequences. And in this case, it cost the lives of 23 people. Part of the reason that the national and state narrative has been able to sort of dominate the conversation has been the utter destruction of local news. We don't have or have not had enough platforms out there, whether it's in El Paso or Canadian, to write honest, on-the-ground stories about what's actually happening in our communities. And that, to me, is a threat to democracies. Maybe not democracy writ large, imperiling the future of Texas, but when El Paso voters have almost no information before going to the polls to make their choices, that is an existential threat to the health of our community. That's one of the reasons that I started El Paso Matters, is to be able to provide some of that kind of information so that people in the El Paso community do know what's happening in their community. And hopefully, as we discuss El Paso and the rest of the border region, there is at least some amount of voice from the border taking part in those conversations. The voices of the border have largely been absent over the last decade when we talk about major policy decisions. Some of that's the fault of people on the border and not getting more engaged. But there are ways to begin to push back, and I think we need these clear voices coming from local communities to tell accurate stories. I'm not here to tell you that the border is perfect or that El Paso is perfect. I'm a journalist. We will tell very painful stories about our community when necessary to make it better. But we also all have obligations, I think, as participants in a democracy to make sure that we're getting coherent, comprehensive stories about what's going on, especially as we then make decisions on the leaders we're going to elect to enforce these policies.
Thanks, Bob. I want to talk a little bit about media ecosystems. And we know that there's not one publication or media outlet who can serve everyone's needs. We know a lot of people get their news from Nextdoor and TikTok and Facebook. So what is, like, in a healthy media ecosystem, what is the relationship between specifically like TV news and newspapers or publications that mainly write stories? I'm curious how this plays out in your community, Laurie, and also how it works in El Paso from Bob.
It's a tough question to answer. The relation in my community between TV news and what we're doing is they usually get their news from us, or they get it from social media. I'd prefer they get it from us, to be honest. And that's really pertinent to one of the big stories that we've covered, and actually, that led to a lawsuit that helped close us down at one point. About a young man in high school who went missing on Thanksgiving Eve and who was not found for 2 years until his body was found somewhere near a lake outside of town. And it turned into a big, huge mess because the mother immediately accused our sheriff of having something to do with the young man's death. I'm not going to go into great detail, but the story got taken over in some ways by social media because the mother used social media. And she formed a group called Moms for Tom that grew, I don't know, to thousands. I think it was probably a fundraising vehicle. But the other media in the area basically got their story from her social media posts. And so it spread like wildfire all over the Panhandle, all over the state, eventually all over the country, and I think beyond that. Our job was to try and get the facts, and we did so as well as we could, but at one point, the story just made no sense anymore. The story was there were too many inaccuracies and too many contradictions and too many things that I interviewed the mother several times, and every time I interviewed her, she gave me different answers to the same questions. And so I got more and more concerned about what was going on. And finally, that she had managed to get several law enforcement agencies to investigate this. And the Texas Attorney General's criminal investigations team finally investigated it. They, at some point, met with the family, the Moms for Tom, their ministers, their families, anybody but the press. We were not allowed in. I got a recording that someone had made during the meeting. Immediately after the meeting was over, Moms for Tom and the mother went out and started telling everybody what was said in the meeting. When I listened to the recording, I realized that it was a completely different story. I spent several days and nights going back over the facts of the case, listening to the recording, documenting the contradictions, and reported it in a fairly long story that ran for 2 weeks. The story I wrote was picked up by a local, by an area radio station DJ who had a morning show. Very conservative guy, didn't like my politics at all. Read my report word by word over the air during his morning show. It broke the whole thing open because suddenly people realized they weren't getting facts, they weren't getting the truth, they were getting some version of the story. And so to me, and the TV stations were getting their story from social media. So it was a very difficult story to write and a very difficult story to cover. But I think we did the job that wasn't being done, and we had the community's trust. It was a difficult story to write, and it certainly made the mother look like she was less than honest. And that's a tough thing to do when you're dealing with a grieving mother. But it had to be done. And so I think the community trusted us enough to know that we were doing a good job of reporting. That's a distinction that I think is really important. And I'm afraid, I know social media serves a purpose, but I'm afraid it can be pretty toxic and it can be manipulated. And when TV stations get their news from social media, I think there's a big, huge problem. So,
thank you for sharing that. I think one of the important things that I heard from what you said was that the role of the press as a neutral party, trying to understand a situation, trying to gather all the facts to make sense of them, that can be really essential to finding the truth in this. So yes. I think that's a really fascinating version of how that played out in this current ecosystem. Bob, do you want to talk a little bit about the relationship between the newspaper in El Paso and TV news there, and how that tension exists?
Yeah, I think it's important to start with the understanding that television is still the largest source of news for most people in almost any community. When Sherry and I were, younger reporters working for newspapers years ago, the truth was that what was in that day's newspaper each day largely set the agenda for what local television was going to cover. Now you've had local newspapers just decimated across the country. When I worked at the El Paso Times at our peak, I think we had 85 journalists working in the newsroom there. Today, the El Paso Times, where I, in full disclosure, served as editor up until 2017. Today, they have, I think, 12 journalists working for the daily newspaper in El Paso. 5 of them are news reporters for a community of almost 900,000 people. So the newspaper has largely ceded its role, its traditional role of being like a watchdog. Local television is not set up to do that kind of watchdog work because you can't do that kind of reporting in 30-second bites on the evening newscast. And that's where the concept of a news ecosystem is really important, because things start to break down. And often it's the most critical functions envisioned by our founders in creating the First Amendment that are breaking down most rapidly. We don't have reporters working in communities that are doing in-depth looks at the candidates that are running for office, for example. So voters wind up making their decisions almost solely on the basis of what they might have heard from their neighbors or the mailers they got in the mailbox. That is not a healthy way to run a democracy. You also have increasing problems with corruption when you don't have watchdogs around to watch that happen. Social media obviously plays a role in the dissemination of information. And I don't want to just sit here and doomsay all day long. There are some positive things to be said to the democratization of media because of advances in technology. It has given a lot more people an opportunity to have a voice in the process. But part of the challenge becomes how do consumers of that information sort through it all and really know what has credibility. I don't think any community is well served by having one source of local news. That includes my own. I would not want a community that relied solely on me for news. That's just not healthy. So we have to figure out ways of addressing it. And in large part, it's going to be a financial challenge and a business model challenge.
Can I say something about that? Please do. I think that's really important, Bob. When I moved to Texas, I had been working in New York and New Jersey, and the ecosystem was very different because even though I was at Trenton, which was a relatively small capital city town, but I had to compete with the New York Times, the New York Daily News, the Philadelphia paper. When I got to Texas, Texas kind of operates like a bunch of city-states. And at the Express News, all the front pages were in the newsroom so you could see, what did Austin have up today? What did Houston have? Dallas. It was all the same. They were the same papers. We weren't competing for any stories. You had to go way deep to compete. And I think what happened with that is part of the decline because they were so insulated and there was no competition. I mean, there's a lot of things that happened. You know, technology primarily happened, but also when the voice of the newspaper became disengaged from the community, that was part of the decline as well, I think.
Yeah, and one of the things that accelerated that was the loss of local ownership of newspapers. There was a time in our not too distant past where most newspapers were owned by people who lived in the community, much like what you saw in Canadian. There's still pockets of that around Texas, mostly with weekly newspapers, but very few news organizations have a local ownership now.
I want to talk a little bit about technology. One thing I hear from friends who work in local newsrooms is that they're still struggling to adapt from legacy formats to the internet. And so with that in mind, when I look at all the changes that AI will bring to the information ecosystem and this landscape of how we get information, and these changes will happen quickly. Like it might change the way that SEO works and the internet and the way that readers find our products online. How are you kind of thinking about lessons we might have learned from that initial digital transition and what we need to keep in mind going forward since the game's about to change again?
If it's any explanation, I had jet black hair until I started hearing about AI a few months ago. It's the big question out there, not just for the media, but for all of us who consume news, is how will AI disrupt information flows? Right now, and not to get too technical, but most news organizations rely on search to get people to their sites. AI is going to disrupt that model completely in ways that may or may not benefit news organizations. That remains to be seen. The one thing that I can say from somebody who lived through the prior transition in an industry that did not handle it well at all is we need to be much smarter and much more nimble about how we're doing this, but also recognizing that in this current environment, most news organizations have far less wealth than they had 20 years ago when we were moving into this transition. My thought is maybe not having as much wealth tied up in how things used to be may be an advantage this time. working in newspapers, I will tell you that we did not want to let go of our, basic franchises around classified ads and news delivery and everything, because we neglected to realize that consumers actually had a vote in that, and they decided that Craigslist was a much better way to sell their used sofa than in the newspaper. And overnight, one of the newspaper's most profitable lines of business just disappeared, and that was really kind of the start of all of this. So we have to be a lot more thoughtful as we go forward, and it's not just news. The political world's dealing with this too. How you communicate political ideas with people going forward. All of this is going to be a huge change.
It's one of the things that worries me. It's still pretty archaic, I think, political news, as you pointed out. I mean, what do? We do digital ads, we do mail, we do TV. We're making the TV shorter, putting it out in 15-second spots now. But one of the things that worries me is if we're just creating the same divide. If you have a set of podcasts that you listen to, and I have a set that I listen to, and nobody knows what's on the other ones, that we still haven't gotten to what I think of the goal is a fully functioning democracy where people are actually talking, rather than if our world is, if all media is basically a reflection of MSNBC and Fox, we're not going to move forward, I don't think.
Well, and I think there's a real problem with trust, and there's a problem with I find that there's too much news, or it's identified as news, that's really not news. It's commentary, it's opinion. It shouldn't masquerade as news. In my newspaper, the opinion pages were right up front, page 2 and page 3, sometimes when we were really steamed, page 4. And they were clearly identified on every page as opinion. Everybody knew it was opinion. They were letters to the editor, they were my editorials, guest editorials, columns, but it was clearly identified, and the other pages were also clearly identified. News, sports, community. You knew what you were reading, and you knew what its intent was. Now when you look at TV, and you look at the News Hour, or you look at Fox News, you're not getting news, you're getting opinion. And that's fine. Everybody, we have lots of opinions, and that's a great thing to get out there and air, but it should be clearly identified as what it is. And I think we've lost, I think the media the result has been it's lost the public's trust. It's not honest. And I think something's broken down there that needs to be rebuilt.
What does each of you think about how the modern media might approach regaining that trust? Is it as simple as listening? Is it as simple as asking people, well, what do you want from the news? How might we kind of approach trying to solve this problem?
Oh, I was hoping other people would give me the answer to that, because I could really use some help. I think that is an important question, and I think one of the things we have to be honest about when we talk about the decline of media and the threats that presents to us is that much of it is a self-inflicted wound, right? It is because we got away from news, and we got to sort of putting our thumb on the scale in some cases. It's also that media, for most of this nation's history, ignored whole swaths of the communities that we served because the money was made from finding audiences that advertisers sought after, right? And so we became organizations that sort of served the interests of the commercial interests of advertisers rather than focusing on the civic health of communities. We have to get a lot better. To Sherry's point earlier about making sure that we're talking to everybody when we're trying to assess the state of play and what people care about. And we have to also get stronger about fighting back against some forces that deliberately want to seed mistrust. Authoritarians of any stripe, one of the first two areas they tend to go after are the judiciary and the media, because if you can take down public trust in those institutions, it's easier to kind of to build more power to yourselves. So one big step with that, before we even get to that, though, is we have to get our own house in order to make us more trustworthy for the communities we serve. I think we have a long way to go on that.
I think it's very hard because the incentive has changed, and it's all about clicks. As you know, you're in graphics, and I do a little politics, and I think sometimes people don't quite get how we target voters. But when you're polling, and we poll like every word, every phrase, but you're not looking at phrases that are going to persuade people. If you all look at all the political mail that you're getting, you probably agree with most of it, because you look at people that are likely to agree with you. Active partisans, latent allies, and people that don't know anything about the topic, and then they might be likely to. Those people who feel differently, who have a different perspective, you just take you're not marketing to them. This is voting. I'm not saying media is like this, but I'm just saying this is the problem. Those people aren't on your list. You're not sending mail to them. You're not advertising to them. So, but for media that is living on clicks, what you want to do is to put it out there and say, you know what? 15,000 people crossed the border today. Yeah, 900 of them were from Afghanistan.
I do think media has picked up a lot of the habits in politics that you're talking about, because the goal is not to enlighten anymore. I think by and large, it's to anger. And one of the challenges is people have found that a lot of ways to make money and to build power by getting people angry. Nobody's figured out a formula yet, or tried to figure it out, I think, on how you make money or build political success by bringing people together. And so, we used to talk a lot in politics about, targeting swing voters and persuading swing voters, and now that's not what elections are about. Elections are about motivating bases, right? And so you get people angry, and you want to make sure that the people who support you turn out. And the best way to do that is usually to get them angry. Unfortunately, media has picked up on a lot of that. And it's like, oh, I've got this great story that's really going to piss people off. Let's get that out there. It's not healthy for communities. I don't know if it's healthy for a political system, but it's definitely not healthy for communities.
We have circled around talking about voting a couple different points in this conversation, so I wanted to kind of bring it back to that a little bit. Bob, a few days ago, you tweeted that after 3 days of early voting, only about 300 of the 9,000 early voters in El Paso primaries were under the age of 30. So we're a few days more into that process now, but I assume that the pattern holds. What role does the changing media landscape, if any, play in this lack of engagement among younger Texans? And is that something that is solvable? How can we kind of approach this problem?
So update, after 7 days of early voting, we're up to about 16,000 voters in El Paso, which is 3% of registered voters. That figure in itself is abysmal, but normal for El Paso. We are all the way up to 500 and some people under 30 having voted in El Paso. In El Paso, and I would guess that most Texas communities are going to be like this. After a week of early voting in El Paso, there are about 17 voters over the age of 65 for every one voter under the age of 30. And again, that's a typical process. And I think part of it is who campaigns target. to get them out to vote. In El Paso, there is not a lot of money in politics, so campaigns have to be very strategic about who they target. So they just find everybody who voted in the last 3 primaries and target them. And nobody is going to reach out to you if you haven't voted. And if you're under 30, just by being under 30, you probably have not voted in a whole lot of elections. So one of the biggest barriers to voting is, to me, is a simple one. We don't ask people to vote and don't give them a reason to vote. So that is going to be a very difficult process to fix. El Paso is the nation's 23rd largest city, 6th largest city in Texas. In November, even if everybody gets fired up and gets out to vote, only about half the registered voters in El Paso are going to cast ballots. This in an election where I guarantee you El Paso will be one of the major issues in the country, and we will not be able to motivate half of our registered voters to turn out to vote.
Why do you think that is?
Again, this is not new, unfortunately. I think in part people have become disconnected because of the partisan divides, and if you're not one of those who wants to go around being angry all day long, you're going to want to tune that stuff out, and so all of this extreme partisanship that we see out there becomes a disincentive to vote. And again, El Paso is an extreme on this in Texas, but it plays out all throughout the state. As we all know, Texas has one of the lowest voting turnout rates in the country. So Texas is at the bottom of the nation. El Paso and other border communities are at the bottom of Texas when it comes to turnout.
Was that different when Beto was running, your hometown guy?
There was a surge in 2018. So you have to say which time Beto was running. So in 2018, we saw by far our largest midterm turnout in El Paso's history. There was a lot of new enthusiasm. And then when he lost, I think one of the things that happens when you're new to the process and you get really excited, it's really great when you win. When you lose, it becomes a disincentivier again. So fast forward to the next midterm election in 2022, Beto's on the ballot again, this time challenging Governor Abbott. The turnout in El Paso came nowhere near where we were in 2018.
Well, there's a 25-year-old Republican running for the legislature in the Panhandle in Amarillo.
Yes, there is. Don't know much about that either. But.
I heard her speak, and she said this is a tradition. Alexander Hamilton was 21 years old when he signed the Declaration of Independence. So.
She's very well financed.
Yes,
I'll say that.
But by the way, speaking of Republicans running, in El Paso we have 5 running, like in any election. We've got 5 Republicans. That's another part of the turnout problem, I think, is the Republican Party has not been strong since the 1960s in El Paso. I think not having a strong 2-party system does serve as a disincentive, whatever party's on top.
Yeah, I was going to ask how this dynamic plays out in the Panhandle.
Well, it's going to be interesting just in my little burg, because this will be the first year that there hasn't been a newspaper reporting on the candidates. I didn't have time to do what I usually do, which is interview all of the candidates, local candidates, regional candidates. I've done some of that. But it's also the first time, I've been reporting all of the filing deadlines and the, early voting dates and all of that information online. And I can say that we get a fairly large audience, but it's going to be really interesting to see if there's any recognizable change in voter turnout. Hempo County actually turns out very strong for elections. Our percentages are usually large. And that's partly we're an older population, and that has something to do with it. So it'll be interesting to see what happens this year if the newspaper isn't playing the role that it typically has. I'll be interested to see
Is
if turnout is lower.
Is anybody backfilling that role you used to play, or?
No. No. In fact, there are many of the newspapers in our area that are really sort of dying off. And we're not alone. And it's a big concern.
Let me just tell one story, Darla, about election night. So I covered, Republicans have only had control, people in Texas since 2002, and I covered that election, and our headline in the Express News said, Republicans waltz across Texas, or GOP walks across Texas. Bexar County, of course, completely shut down, as they frequently did, and could not get the votes counted. So the subhead under that was, what a mess. And so when you saw it in the news box, these are old news stories. It was Republicans walk across Texas. What a mess.
That's a problematic combination.
I have to make.
You would never have let that happen.
I have to make one correction. There is somebody playing that role, and it's the radio talk show.
But yeah,
owner.
but
And he's doing a very good job. He's interviewing all of the candidates. It's airing on his station. I'm not a radio listener. I don't know who
that's it. And you can't, like, when you have a free moment, go back and listen to it.
Yeah.
You either have to listen to it when it's on.
You can't
or
read
miss
it and think it over. Yeah, I don't know. It's different.
It's just a trade-off. Oh, Mike.
You can see, I saw preparing for this panel that 55% of them get their news off their phone. It's the headlines coming over the phone, not reading online, just the headlines coming off the phone.
Or headlines on TikTok.
Yeah,
Another
headlines on
option.
TikTok.
I want to ask, I think I have time for one more question. So I want to talk about this lack of civic engagement in Texas. Do we think it's due to an information vacuum, or is it because people are cynical and don't think they can change city or county or state government? Like, what do we think is the core cause of this?
I mean, all of the above, I think, play a role. And I think just the sheer size of Texas plays a role, too. By the way, greetings from the Mountain Time Zone, everybody.
We love you during elections.
But I think all of that kind of comes together. And, the other thing, Texas has a young population, by and large. And obviously, Texas is an amazingly diverse state too, but generally speaking, the younger the population you have, the lower your civic engagement's going to be. So there are a lot of factors that come in, and unfortunately, we're not going to solve the problems in the last minute and a half we have left. But this is something that I think is all of our responsibility to address.
Do y'all want to weigh in on that one?
Well, I hesitate to say this, but Texas is the state most people in the country move to. It's the #1 state for Gen Z. They like it here. Maybe people are not that agitated. Maybe if they were agitated about something, they'd go vote.
I would say cynicism. That's what I hear in
That
my
too.
community. Cynicism.
All of the above. All right. You ready for questions, Matt?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have.
You can line up at the mic.
Yes,
and
we have
back your
about 7
question.
minutes
Thank
or
you.
so for questions, and welcome anyone from the audience here to ask questions. I have a very quick one from online, just asking you all about kind of your own media diets and how you think about challenging your own perspectives, and if that's a way that people can think about how else they're getting their information.
That's a great question. Who wants to talk about their media diet?
I'll tell you what I don't do, and at the risk of being expelled from the journalism pool, I don't watch cable news. I just, it's because I do this all day. Once I get home, I just can't take it anymore, right? But as far as like a diet, I try to read a pretty good cross section of opinion news, whether it's the National Review on the right, or New York Times editorial pages on the left. I try to consume as much of that as I can, and I try to at least check in on other publications in Texas, because when you live in El Paso, you start to feel really isolated, and not just because we're here, but the Texas Tribune is a good vehicle for me to catch up on what's happening in the rest of the state.
Similar, I don't watch cable news with the exception of humor. I like to watch Gutfeld at night, and listen to that. I read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and all the big 5 Texas papers, not cover to cover every day. I listen to Ben Shapiro's Morning Wire. Jim Garrity's 3 Martini Lunch, which is great fun if you haven't listened to that, just to hear him shake the martinis. But really try, because I work at a conservative think tank, I think it's very important that I not get in the bubble of just the conservative news. So I try to read pretty far-fetched, which it just kind of, sometimes that's good, sometimes it just is annoying.
I do a lot of reading. I get several magazines. Atlantic Monthly has been doing some great work lately. I read the Texas Tribune religiously. I read Quorum Report. It's a great, covers a lot of various news outlets, and so I get a lot of information from that, and I'm a PBS NewsHour fan, so that's it.
Thank you.
Just a quick question about, are there any magazines that you think present both, a balanced view of politics or current events that you'd recommend?
I don't even know what a balanced view would look like anymore. I really don't. I mean, it just seems we get whiplash. We go from one extreme to the other, and I just look for thoughtful writing, and regardless of the political viewpoint, I like to think about what I'm reading. I like to be challenged, and I read a lot. So I don't know about. Do you have any?
I'm a big fan of CBS Sunday Morning. It's an old magazine format with Jane Pauley, and they cover lots of stuff, not just news. And I think it's, it leans a little lefty, but not much.
I've been a big fan of The Atlantic for a long time. And again, I don't look to news magazines for balance. I look for good writing. And The Atlantic does do, I think its politics generally are pretty clear, but toward the left end of the spectrum. But they actually have some pretty diverse viewpoints that come through.
I was actually thinking about The Week. Do you know that? The Week magazine?
I've seen it, but it's not part of my media diet.
I think it usually gives, it gives usually more than one opinion. So that's my recommendation.
Thank you for the recommendation.
I've noticed a significant not inclusive of African Americans on the panel today. And I want to talk about some papers in Houston. The Houston Chronicle, the South Belt Leader, which is owned by Marie Flickinger, and the Houston Informer newspaper, or the Defender newspaper. Those papers, not the Chronicle, but those papers have made a name for themselves by putting in personality news, where they pick the teacher of the week, the high school football player of the week. They still do the editorials, but because they stay in the conversation of what people are talking about, they're talking and bragging about their kids in sports. They're talking about who's gotten married, who's died. All of that's editorial content too, because some people are good, some people are bad, but you've got to have diversity. You just can't talk about politics and issues that affect some parts of the community and not others. If you don't do that, take the Chronicle, for example. Here you have other papers that have made a name for covering business, for covering politics. There's a paper here called Paper City. It's the #1 society publication. If you do something and you got money and a $3,000 dress to wear to a lawn party, you want to be in that paper. So what has happened to the diversity in editorial journalism? I haven't heard you mention that. You've been focused just on certain things. And when it comes to the border, we have alliances with other countries. And do you know who's crossing the border now? Technology people, educators, attorneys, doctors. Have you heard about that? Let's talk about who crossed the border in the 80s. How do you think we had a home building boom? You remember Joe the plumber? The lady out of Alaska was talking about Joe the plumber. Who do you think let Jose the plumber in the country? You didn't hear about no massive border crossings back then because we needed people to build houses. So we opened up the border and we had a housing boom. Have you forgotten about that? So why is it now we complaining about people across the border when it was politically needed back then?
Hey, thank you so much for your comments. I really appreciate it.
Hold on, one last thing, and I'll be through, promise. What are you doing about the education thing? You know, when they wrote the Constitution, somebody asked one of the guys, how are you going to protect the Constitution? You know what he said? We're going to give everybody a free education. So when you talk about these vouchers, where do you think the money comes from? HISD, the school district you're sitting in right now, is poor. Do you know why? Because they call the roll every morning. The teachers have to turn in their attendance. It goes to the attendance clerk. It goes to the HISD main office, and then they turn it into the state to get their money for every butt in the seat. So every time you take a white kid out of school or a black kid out of school or a Hispanic out of, and put them in a charter school, that takes money away from the public education system. I didn't hear you say nothing about that.
Amen.
Okay, that's why we don't have, the charters are not good. Now, if you want your kid in a private school, then you need to get up off your butt and put the money in the pot yourself. But don't take it out of the public fund, the public trust. That's what brought us all together. That's why we're here.
Thank you so much for your comments. And thank you to the panelists and all the attendees here. We really appreciate the conversation. Thanks. We're all out of time for this one.
I want to thank.
Our next panel coming up next.
Yes.
I really think that you made a very important point about the black press. A very important point, and I think we have lost that, and we're looking around at how are we going to bring media back together.
That's
and
a really,
that
yeah,
is a piece
that's absolutely fair.
that we missed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, panel. We're going to move on to our next program, but let's thank the panel very much.